It was supposed to be a glamorous charity gala, a night of wealth and elegance under crystal chandeliers, until a millionaire lost his temper and turned the ballroom into a nightmare. In front of hundreds of guests, he struck his pregnant wife with a leather whip, 300 lashes of pure rage, while the crowd stood frozen in shock. But what he didn't know was that the woman he tried to break was the daughter of one of the most powerful CEOs in America. What follows is a storm of power, revenge, and cold justice that will shake the city to its core. Stay right here, because you won't believe how this story ends. Tell us what time you're watching and where you're tuning in from, and drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The Waldorf Astoria gleamed like a palace that night. Crystal chandeliers hung above the marble floor, scattering soft blue light over the sea of gowns and tuxedos. Laughter mixed with the hum of a string quartet, and every table sparkled with champagne. Cameras flashed as New York's elite gathered for the charity gala of the year. No one could have guessed that before the night ended, that same ballroom would witness a scene of horror. Isabella Carter stood near the back of the room, her hands folded over her 7-month belly. Her light sky blue dress looked plain among the designer gowns around her. She had altered it herself that morning, sewing the seams tighter to fit her growing form. Her hair was neatly pinned, her face pale from exhaustion. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. She did not belong in this glittering world anymore, though she once believed she did. Her husband, Edward Kane, stood at the center of the ballroom surrounded by admirers. He was the man of the hour, the ruthless millionaire investor who knew how to charm every crowd. His black tuxedo fit perfectly. His voice carried authority. His smile looked like confidence carved in stone. But beside him, clinging to his arm in a red silk gown, was Vanessa Moore, his mistress. She whispered something into his ear and laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. Guests exchanged glances, pretending not to notice the wife watching from a distance. Isabella took a slow breath. Her hands trembled slightly, and she gripped her clutch tighter. She had begged Edward to let her stay home. Her ankles were swollen, her back ached, but he refused. "You'll come and smile," he had said coldly. "I won't have you embarrassing me by hiding." So she came, just as she always did, quiet and obedient, like the perfect wife he demanded. She stood there now, enduring the whispers and stares. Vanessa turned her head and smirked, raising her glass. Isabella looked away, her vision blurring. The air around her felt heavy, suffocating. She reached for a passing tray, needing something to hold on to. The waiter hesitated, then handed her a glass of red wine. She only wanted to blend in, to appear normal. But her hand shook, the glass tilted. A few drops of Bordeaux spilled across Edward's pristine white sleeve. Time stopped. The music faded. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. Edward's smile froze. He looked down at his sleeve, then at his wife. His eyes, gray and cold as metal, narrowed with rage. "You stupid woman!" he hissed. The guests stiffened. Vanessa's painted lips curled in amusement. "I'm sorry," Isabella whispered, her voice breaking. "It was an accident." Edward grabbed her wrist so hard she gasped. "You ruined my suit in front of everyone," he growled. "Do you even know what that costs?" She tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. The room fell into an eerie silence. Even the quartet stopped playing. "Edward, please," she whispered. "Not here." "Why not?" he said, his tone sharp as glass. "Maybe this crowd should see what kind of wife I have." Before anyone could move, he dragged her toward the center of the ballroom. Champagne glasses trembled on tables. Cameras turned in their direction. He yanked the decorative leather whip from the charity display, a collector's item meant for auction. The crowd gasped. For a second, Isabella thought he was bluffing. He wasn't. The first lash cracked through the air like thunder. The sound echoed against marble walls. Isabella screamed, stumbling forward as pain tore through her back. The second lash struck harder, then another. "Stop it!" someone shouted, but no one moved. 50 lashes, then 100. Each one cut deeper than the last. Isabella fell to her knees, one hand clutching her stomach, the other bracing against the cold floor. Tears streamed down her face. She whispered to her unborn child between sobs, "Hold on, baby. Please hold on." Vanessa stood still, sipping champagne, her eyes glinting. Pathetic. she murmured to the woman beside her. The lashes continued. The whip cracked again and again until the air itself seemed to cry. Blood seeped through the thin fabric of Isabella's blue dress. Her breaths turned shallow. The pain blurred her vision, but one thought anchored her: protect the baby. She bent forward, curling around her belly, shielding it from the blows that rained down like fire. Guests whispered frantically. "She's pregnant," someone said. "He's lost his mind." But fear kept them frozen. Edward Kane was too powerful, too dangerous to confront. When the whip finally fell silent after the 300th strike, Isabella collapsed completely, her cheek pressed against the marble floor, cold and slick with tears. Edward's chest heaved with fury. He dropped the whip beside her and spat the words that silenced the room. "That's what happens when you embarrass me." No one moved. Cameras blinked like eyes in the dark. Then the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. The crowd parted instinctively as a tall man in a black suit entered. His presence shifted the entire room. Conversations died. It was Robert Carter, CEO of Carter Holdings, the sponsor of the gala, the father of the woman lying broken on the floor. He had arrived late after an emergency meeting, unaware of what had happened. But the moment he saw Isabella's bloodied dress and her trembling hands covering her belly, his expression changed. He walked forward slowly. His shoes clicked against the marble. Edward turned, his smirk faltering. "Mr. Carter," he started, voice shaking slightly. "This isn't what it looks like. Robert cut him off. His voice was low, calm, but it carried through every corner of the hall. "You just beat my daughter." The silence was deafening. Robert knelt beside Isabella, gently lifting her head. Her lips quivered, her eyes half closed. "Dad," she whispered weakly. "I'm sorry." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You have nothing to be sorry for." His gaze rose to Edward. "But he will be." He stood, still holding Isabella protectively. Around them, flashes from cameras exploded like lightning. The blue chandeliers reflected off the tears on her cheeks. For the first time that night, Edward Kane looked afraid. And that was the exact moment the world began to turn against him. The night of the gala ended in chaos. Guests fled the ballroom, whispering in disbelief, their diamond heels clicking over marble as security tried to restore order. But Robert Carter stood still, holding his daughter in his arms. The music had stopped, but its echo still lingered in the room like a haunting memory. Isabella's light blue dress was torn and soaked in blood. Her body trembled against his chest. He could feel her heartbeat, faint but present, like a fragile drum that refused to stop. Outside the hotel, the flashing lights of ambulances painted the night in red and white. Photographers surrounded the entrance, shouting questions. "Mr. Carter, is it true that Mr. Kane attacked his wife? How is she? Will there be charges?" Robert said nothing. His face was pale, expression carved in stone. He placed Isabella inside the waiting ambulance, then climbed in beside her. Inside, the paramedic worked quickly. "She's in shock," the woman said, checking Isabella's pulse. "But the baby's still moving. We'll know more once we reach the hospital." Robert's hands clenched into fists. He looked down at his daughter, whispering softly, "Hold on, sweetheart. Just hold on." The ambulance raced through the midnight streets of Manhattan, sirens wailing. Robert stared out the window, the city lights blurring past like streaks of guilt. He had built empires, crushed rivals, moved mountains in the business world. Yet at that moment, he felt powerless. He had missed everything. He had missed the signs, the bruises she hid, the way her laughter had faded each time he called. He had failed as a father. At St. Mary's Hospital, doctors rushed Isabella into the emergency ward. Robert waited outside the glass doors, every second heavier than the last. Finally, a doctor emerged, removing his mask. "She's stable," he said carefully. "The wounds are severe, but she's strong. The baby's heartbeat is faint but steady. We're monitoring both closely." Robert nodded once, relief washing over him, but his eyes remained hard. "I want the best staff on her, whatever it costs." The doctor hesitated. "Of course, Mr. Carter, but you should know, the media is already outside. The story is spreading fast." Robert turned toward the corridor window. Through the glass, he could see flashes of camera lights outside the hospital gates. "Let them talk," he said quietly. "Tonight the world will see what kind of monster he really is." When Isabella woke hours later, dawn had just begun to lighten the sky. Her eyes fluttered open to the sound of soft beeping and the sterile smell of antiseptic. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming. Then she saw her father sitting beside her bed. His gray hair was messy, his tie undone, his eyes rimmed red. "Dad?" she whispered. Robert leaned forward immediately, taking her hand. "I'm here," he said. "You're safe now." She looked around the room, confusion mixing with fear. The baby's still fighting," he said gently. "Just like you." Tears filled her eyes. "I thought I was going to lose everything." Robert's voice trembled slightly. "You will not lose anything again. Not while I'm breathing." She turned her face away, ashamed. "I didn't tell you how bad it was. I thought I could fix it. I thought if I stayed quiet, he'd change." Robert shook his head slowly. That man was never going to change. Men like him only understand power. And now he's about to learn that he attacked the wrong family. She blinked, startled by the steel in his tone. "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done a long time ago," he said, rising to his feet. "I'm going to destroy him." That morning, the news exploded across every network. Millionaire investor Edward Kane attacks pregnant wife at charity gala. Carter family demands justice. Video clips of the assault flooded social media. Some guests had secretly recorded the entire event. The footage showed Isabella collapsing, Edward towering over her, whip in hand. The world watched in horror. In the boardroom of Carter Holdings, Robert faced his son, David Carter, and their longtime legal advisor, Sarah Chen. The city skyline glowed behind them in the morning light. David slammed his fist on the table. "We can't just sit here. He nearly killed her." Sarah adjusted her glasses calmly. "We need to move strategically. Emotional decisions lead to mistakes. We'll start with the evidence, build a criminal and civil case, and make sure the press gets the truth." Robert's eyes burned with fury. "Make it happen. Every connection, every reporter, every shareholder he has, I want them to see him for what he is." David nodded grimly. "I'll contact Aaron. He can trace Kane Group's shell companies and financial crimes. We'll hit him from both sides, legal and economic." Sarah looked at Robert. "You understand what you're starting, don't you? This will be public, brutal. There's no going back." Robert's jaw tightened. "He made it public when he laid a hand on my daughter." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Isabella lay awake watching the sunrise through the window. The light was pale blue, gentle, like the color of her torn dress. The nurses whispered as they passed. She could feel the world watching her, judging her, pitying her. She hated it. But when she looked at her father standing by the doorway, phone pressed to his ear, his expression hard with determination, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Later that day, Robert entered her room again. He sat down beside her, softer now. "I spoke to the doctors. You'll need rest, but you'll recover. The baby's condition is improving too." She nodded weakly. "What about Edward?" "He's hiding," Robert replied. "His lawyers are scrambling. But don't worry, the moment he steps out, the world will be waiting for him." She closed her eyes, whispering, "I don't want revenge, Dad. I just want peace." Robert reached over, brushing her hair back. "Peace will come, but only when justice is done." Outside, cameras flashed through the hospital windows. Reporters shouted her name. "Isabella, do you forgive him? Will you testify?" She turned away from the noise, holding her father's hand. "Do whatever you have to, Dad. Just make sure he can never hurt anyone again." Robert nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I intend to do." He stood and walked to the door, pausing for a final glance at his daughter resting in the pale light. In that moment, he stopped being a businessman and became something far more dangerous. He became a father at war. Morning light spilled across the skyline of Manhattan as the Carter Holdings boardroom came to life. The room was vast, lined with glass walls that overlooked the city, a view usually reserved for billion-dollar negotiations. But today, there were no contracts or mergers on the table, only vengeance. Robert Carter stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his reflection framed by the cold glow of the windows. His gray eyes were steady, calm on the surface but burning underneath. The world had seen his daughter's suffering, and silence was no longer an option. David Carter entered carrying a laptop, his expression tight with anger. "The footage from the gala is everywhere," he said. Every outlet has it. CNN, The Times, even overseas. Edward Kane has become the most hated man in America overnight. Robert did not look surprised. "Good," he said quietly. "Let the world see what he really is." Across the table sat Sarah Chen, the family's chief legal advisor. Her navy suit was crisp, her tone measured. "We can't rely on emotion," she began. "We need strategy. I've already spoken with the district attorney's office. They're willing to open a criminal investigation if we provide direct evidence. The video helps, but we need corroborating testimony." Robert nodded slowly. "We'll get it. Start with the witnesses who were at the gala." Sarah's brows furrowed. "Most of them are terrified of crossing Kane. He has money, connections, influence." Robert's voice hardened. "Then remind them that he no longer has protection. The Carters do." David set the laptop on the table and played a clip. The video showed Edward raising the whip, the crowd frozen around him, the sickening sound of the strike echoing through the ballroom. Isabella's cry filled the room. Even though they had already seen it 100 times, the pain was fresh every time it played. Sarah lowered her eyes. "We'll win this, Robert, but it won't be easy." "You?" David clenched his jaw. "I don't care how long it takes. He nearly killed her. He needs to lose everything. His name, his company, his freedom." Robert placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You and I agree on that." At the far end of the room, the glass doors opened. Aaron Lee, David's trusted assistant, entered carrying several folders. He was quiet but sharp, the kind of man who could dig through a mountain of data and find the single line that would destroy an empire. "I have something," Aaron said, placing the folders on the table. "Kane Group has a network of offshore accounts. Most of the funds are linked to shell corporations in Singapore and Zurich. They look clean, but they're not. There are payments that trace back to campaign contributions, bribery, even property purchases under fake names." Robert's gaze sharpened. "How much proof do we have?" Aaron opened one of the folders, revealing a series of wire transfers. "Enough to start a financial investigation. If we leak this to the media, it'll trigger a panic among his investors. The stock will crash before he can respond." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "If we leak it too soon, he'll play the victim. Let's make sure the authorities are already watching him before the story hits." Robert thought for a moment, then nodded. "Do both. File a report quietly with the SEC. Then leak it in 48 hours. Aaron smiled faintly. "Understood." "Lo." David looked at his father. "We're going to war, aren't we?" Robert met his eyes. "No. War is chaos. This will be precision. Every strike planned. Every move calculated. He won't even realize he's fallen until it's already over." While the Carters planned their counterattack, the rest of the city buzzed with gossip. The footage from the gala dominated every news cycle. Outside Kane Group headquarters, protesters held signs that read "Justice for Isabella" and "No excuse for violence." Inside that same building, Edward Kane sat in his office, seething. His lawyer, sweating through his suit, stammered as he read the headlines. "It's bad, sir. Investors are pulling out. The board wants an emergency meeting." Edward slammed his hand on the desk, making the man flinch. "I don't care about investors. Find out who released that footage. We think it came from a guest's phone. There's no way to know who leaked it." Edward leaned back, his jaw tight. "Robert Carter did this. He's behind everything. He's trying to ruin me." The lawyer hesitated. "Sir, with respect, you did this yourself." Edward's glare turned deadly. "Get out!" The man fled the room, leaving Edward alone with his fury. On the television behind him, news anchors replayed the video again and again. Each time, the image of him raising the whip burned deeper into his mind. Meanwhile, at Carter Holdings, Robert was meeting privately with Sarah and Aaron again. "We'll need witnesses from his staff," Sarah said. "Someone who's seen his abuse firsthand." Aaron hesitated. "There is one person, Linda Parker. She used to be the head housekeeper in the Kane residence. She left last month. If anyone knows his habits, she does." Robert leaned forward. "Find her." Aaron nodded and left the room immediately. David walked over to the window, staring at the skyline. "I used to think the worst kind of evil was corruption in business," he said quietly. "I was wrong. The worst kind is what a man does when he thinks no one will stop him." Robert joined him by the glass. "And now he'll learn that someone will." Back at the hospital, Isabella was slowly regaining her strength. She watched the news from her bed, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Every headline carried her name. Some called her brave, others called her tragic. She didn't feel either. She just felt tired. But when she saw her father's face on television, standing in front of microphones, with the Carter Holdings logo behind him, her heart swelled. He spoke calmly, his voice steady. No man, no matter how rich or powerful, has the right to harm another human being. My daughter will recover, and justice will prevail. The reporters erupted in questions, but Robert walked away without another word. Isabella smiled faintly, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time, she realized that her father wasn't just fighting for her. He was fighting for every woman who had ever been silenced by fear. In another part of the city, Edward Kane poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring at his reflection in the window. He whispered to himself, voice low and venomous, "They think they can destroy me. They have no idea who they're dealing with." But he was wrong, because the Carters had already begun. The days after the gala passed like a blur of light and pain. In St. Mary's Hospital, the rhythmic beeping of monitors filled the sterile air. Outside Isabella's room, flowers and letters piled high from strangers who had seen the footage. Reporters camped on the sidewalk, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. But inside the quiet ward, Isabella Carter lived in a world of silence. Every breath hurt. Her back was covered in bandages, her arms bruised. Each time she moved, the skin burned. Yet the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight that pressed on her chest. Shame, guilt, fear, they sat in her mind like stones. She stared out the window at the early morning sky. The light was soft and blue, almost the same color as the dress she had worn that night. A nurse adjusted her IV line and smiled gently. "You're healing well, Mrs. Kane." Isabella flinched at the name. "Please," she whispered, "don't call me that." The nurse paused, understanding. "Of course, Miss Carter." When the nurse left, Isabella exhaled shakily. She turned her gaze to the small TV mounted on the wall. The news was playing yet again, showing the same clip of the gala. Edward's face twisted in anger, the whip flashing under the chandeliers, the sound of her scream echoing through the ballroom. She closed her eyes, unable to watch. A knock broke the silence. Robert entered quietly, holding a folder under his arm. He looked tired, older somehow, but his eyes were steady. "How's my girl?" he asked softly. She gave a small, broken smile. "Alive." He walked to her side, placing the folder on the table. "That's enough for now." She looked at the folder curiously. "What's that?" "Evidence," he said. "Sarah and David have been digging, but we're missing one thing." "What is it?" "Someone who saw what he was like behind closed doors. Someone who can speak without fear." Before Isabella could answer, another knock came. The door opened slowly, and Linda Parker stepped inside. Isabella froze. Linda was in her mid-40s, wearing a simple gray coat. Her hands fidgeted nervously as she looked at the young woman in the hospital bed. "Mrs. Carter," she said softly, her voice trembling. "It's me, Linda. I used to work for you." Isabella's eyes widened. "Linda, I thought you left months ago." Linda nodded. "I did. I couldn't watch anymore. But after what happened, I knew I had to come forward." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small flash drive. "I recorded everything. The gala, the night it happened, and other nights too." Robert's eyes sharpened. "Other nights?" Linda nodded again, tears glistening. "He hit her before, several times, when she was too scared to scream, when no one else was around. I thought he'd stop when she got pregnant. I was wrong." Isabella's hands trembled. "You filmed it?" "I hid cameras in the living room," Linda said. "For my own safety. I never meant to expose him, but after that night, I couldn't stay silent anymore." Robert stepped forward, placing a hand on Linda's shoulder. "You did the right thing." Linda looked at Isabella, guilt clouding her face. "I should have done it sooner. Maybe then." Isabella shook her head weakly. "No, you saved me now. That's what matters." Robert took the flash drive and slipped it into the folder. "This will change everything." When Linda left, the room fell silent again. Robert sat down, his tone softer. "You see, sweetheart, even in darkness, there are still people willing to stand up." Isabella stared at the window again, her reflection faint against the morning light. "I don't feel strong, Dad. I feel broken." Robert took her hand. "Strength doesn't mean you don't break. It means you refuse to stay broken." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can face the world again." "You will," he said. "And when you do, they'll see you not as a victim, but as the proof that justice exists." That night, Isabella could not sleep. The words echoed in her mind. Refused to stay broken. She thought about the years she had lost, the laughter that had disappeared, the love that had turned into fear. She remembered how Edward had controlled everything, what she wore, who she spoke to, even what she ate. Now, lying in that hospital bed, she realized something. The power he had over her ended the moment he struck her in front of the world. She had nothing left to lose, which meant she finally had something dangerous. Freedom. The next morning, she asked the nurse for a mirror. The woman hesitated. "You should rest." "I need to see," Isabella said firmly. The nurse handed her a small hand mirror. Isabella looked at her reflection. Her face was pale. There was a faint bruise along her jaw. Her hair was messy, but her eyes looked different. They were no longer afraid. When Robert returned later that day, she greeted him with a calm he hadn't seen before. "Dad," she said quietly, "I want to testify." He blinked, surprised. "You're sure?" "Yes, he hurt me. He hurt the baby. He humiliated me in front of the world. If I stay silent now, it means he wins. I can't let that happen." Robert studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right, but when we do this, we do it our way. With control. With truth." "Agreed," she said. He smiled faintly. "Your mother would be proud of you." Isabella looked toward the window again. The sun had shifted, filling the room with soft blue light. For the first time since the attack, it didn't feel cold. It felt like a beginning. Later that evening, Sarah Chen arrived with documents for Isabella to sign. "We'll move forward carefully," she said. "The law can be slow, but the truth has power." As Sarah spoke, Robert watched his daughter signing each paper, her hand steady. He realized that something within her had changed. The same quiet girl who once endured everything in silence was gone. Isabella Carter had awakened. In the weeks that followed, her recovery continued. The bruises faded, the wounds healed. But the fire in her eyes only grew stronger. She was no longer hiding behind fear. She was stepping into her own strength, ready to face the man who had tried to destroy her. And far away, in his penthouse, Edward Kane poured himself another drink, unaware that the woman he thought he had broken was about to become the very force that would end him. The wind howled outside the Carter Holdings tower, rattling the tall glass windows as the storm of justice began to build. Inside the boardroom, the air was thick with focus. Robert Carter sat at the head of the table, his eyes sharp as steel. Across from him sat Sarah Chen, stacks of legal folders spread before her like weapons waiting to be drawn. David Carter stood beside her, arms crossed, his jaw tense. "The media pressure is working," he said. "But Kane still has money. He's hiding behind a team of lawyers." Robert nodded. "That's why we'll take away the one thing he thinks can protect him, his empire." Sarah opened one of the folders and pulled out a document stamped with Kane Group's logo. "We found something." Edward forged Isabella's signature on multiple financial statements. He transferred assets from their joint accounts into offshore holdings under fake names. There's also a deed signed with her name for property in the Hamptons. She never authorized it. David's eyes widened. "So he used her signature to steal her own wealth?" "Exactly," Sarah replied. "And that is fraud. If we file this correctly, he'll face both criminal and financial ruin." Robert leaned forward, his voice low. "Make sure every piece of evidence is verified. I don't want him slipping through on a technicality." Aaron Lee entered, his tablet glowing with spreadsheets and digital trails. "I traced the offshore accounts," he said. He funneled money through 5 shell corporations. Some of them are registered under Vanessa Moore's name. At the mention of Vanessa, the room grew colder. Robert spoke first. "Get her in here." 2 days later, inside a quiet, private office, Vanessa Moore sat across from Sarah Chen and a camera crew. She looked nothing like the glamorous woman from the gala. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights. The red dress had been replaced with a plain gray suit. Sarah adjusted her recorder. "Miss Moore, do you understand that this statement will be used in court?" Vanessa nodded slowly. "Yes." "Tell us about the accounts," Sarah said. Vanessa hesitated, then sighed. "He told me to open them. He said it was for business convenience. I didn't question it. He'd get drunk and brag about how he could make anyone's name appear on paper. He used her signature often. He'd laugh about it. Did you ever see him forge it yourself? Sarah asked. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. Yes, once. He practiced until it looked perfect. David, standing in the corner, clenched his fists. Sarah continued calmly. Did he ever mention hurting Isabella physically before the gala? Vanessa nodded again. He said she was weak, that he had to keep her in line. I tried to ignore it, but after that night, I can't anymore. I saw her fall. I saw the blood, and I did nothing. I can't undo it, but I can tell the truth. Sarah closed her folder. That's all I need. Thank you. When Vanessa left, David turned to Sarah. Do you think she's being honest? Sarah replied, yes. And even if she isn't, the documents don't lie. Later that evening, Robert joined Sarah in his office overlooking the city. The storm outside had turned to rain, tapping rhythmically on the windows. We file tomorrow, he said quietly, and we release it to the press right after. Sarah looked at him. You know what this means. The Kane Group will collapse overnight. Thousands of employees will be affected. Robert's voice was steady. Then they'll learn what it means to build on corruption. Edward made his choice. Now he'll face it. Meanwhile, in her hospital room, Isabella was reading the latest headlines on her phone. The articles were relentless. Every channel spoke her name. The beaten wife who fights back. The Carter family declares war. She felt exposed, yet strangely powerful. Her story was no longer hidden. Robert visited later that night. He sat beside her bed and took her hand. We found proof, he said. She looked up, confused. Proof of what? That he stole from you. He forged your name to move millions into secret accounts. Her lips parted in shock. He used my signature? Yes, but now it's over. Sarah is filing the case tomorrow. She fell silent, staring at her hands. I don't care about the money. I just want him to stop breathing down my life. Yeah. Robert's expression softened. He already lost that power. Every time you speak, he loses more. Isabella nodded faintly. Then let's finish it. The next morning, the Carter legal team filed the lawsuit in the Supreme Court of New York. It was a massive document filled with pages of bank records, forged contracts, and testimony from Vanessa Moore. Within hours, news agencies broke the story. Edward Kane accused of forging wife's signature and hiding millions. Carter Holdings provides evidence of financial fraud. Television screens across the city showed Robert Carter standing at a podium. This is not about wealth, he said firmly. It is about truth. When a man lies to the world and steals from his own family, he forfeits his right to stand among decent people. Reporters shouted questions, but he walked away, his calm presence saying more than any headline could. In the Kane Group headquarters, Edward's face turned crimson as he watched the broadcast. That old man thinks he can destroy me, he barked. He has no idea who he's dealing with. His assistant entered timidly. Sir, the stock dropped 30% in the last hour. The board is demanding answers. Edward slammed his glass against the wall. Tell them to shut up. But the fall had already begun. Investors withdrew. Partners canceled contracts. The company that once symbolized luxury now represented disgrace. That evening, Vanessa appeared on national television. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I was wrong to stay silent. I saw what he did to her, and I will testify in court. No woman deserves what Isabella Carter endured. Across the city, in her hospital room, Isabella watched the interview. Her throat tightened. For the first time, she felt something close to justice stirring in her chest. Robert called her soon after. It's starting, he said. The empire is crumbling. She closed her eyes, whispering, then let it burn. Outside, the night sky over Manhattan glowed faintly blue, the same shade as her dress, the color of a woman rising from ruin. Rain poured over New York City like a curtain of judgment. The storm had not stopped since the lawsuit was filed. It was as if the sky itself had chosen a side. On the top floor of Kane Group headquarters, Edward Kane stood before a wall of television screens. Every channel displayed his face, the word fraud flashing in bold headlines beneath it. His empire, built on arrogance and intimidation, was collapsing in real time. He slammed the remote onto the marble counter. Get the press ready, he barked at his assistant. If they want a show, I'll give them one." Within hours, cameras gathered in the lobby of his building. Edward appeared before them wearing a navy suit, his tie perfect, his hair slicked back. The flashes from the cameras hit him like lightning. He smiled as if the world was still his. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began smoothly, "what you've heard is a lie. My so-called wife and her family are staging an elaborate smear campaign to destroy me. They forged documents, manipulated footage, and twisted the truth for sympathy." The reporters erupted with questions. "Mr. Kane, are you denying the video?" He lifted his hand. "The video was edited. It was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. My wife and I had a disagreement, nothing more." His voice dripped with arrogance, but the reporters were not convinced. "What about the forged signatures and offshore accounts?" someone shouted. Edward's smile faltered. "Fabrications," he said. "Robert Carter is a bitter old man who envies my success. He will say anything to protect his family's crumbling reputation." Far across the city, in the Carter Holdings Tower, Robert watched the broadcast on a giant screen. He stood with David, Sarah, and Aaron. The sound of Edward's voice filled the room. David's fists clenched. "He's blaming us for everything." Robert's expression did not change. "Let him speak," he said calmly. "The louder he lies, the deeper he digs his grave." Sarah adjusted her glasses. "We can't stay silent forever. The court of public opinion is as important as the legal one." Robert nodded slowly. "Then we respond our way. No shouting, just truth." Aaron opened his laptop. "The footage from Linda Parker's camera is ready. The original version, uncut. I can release it to every major network within 10 minutes. David turned to his father. "Do it." Robert raised a hand. "Wait." He looked at Sarah. "I want a written statement to go with it. Something official." Sarah typed quickly, her voice steady as she read aloud. "Carter Holdings supports all victims of domestic abuse. No woman should suffer in silence. This footage is released in defense of truth, not vengeance." Robert nodded. "Now send it." Aaron pressed the key. Across every major network, the video began to play. There was no editing, no music, no manipulation, just raw reality. Edward Kane standing in the ballroom, the whip in his hand, Isabella's cry echoing as he struck her again and again. The crowd's silence. The moment Robert Carter walked in and said the words that froze the nation, "You just beat my daughter," the reaction was immediate. Within minutes, social media exploded. Hashtags filled every feed. "Justice for Isabella. End the silence. Kane must fall." At the hospital, Isabella was watching the same footage. Her nurse gasped softly, "Do you want me to turn it off?" Isabella shook her head. Her heart pounded as she saw herself fall again. As she heard her own voice begging him to stop, it felt like watching someone else, a stranger who once believed silence was strength. Her phone vibrated. A call from Sarah Chen. "Isabella," Sarah said, her tone gentle but firm. "Robert thought you should know we released the footage. It's everywhere now." "I saw it," Isabella said quietly. "He's lying to the press, calling me a manipulator, saying you all forged the evidence." "I know," Sarah replied. "That's why we need you to speak. Just a short message. You don't have to show your face, just your voice." Isabella hesitated, then looked out the window. The rain was still falling, streaking the glass like tears. "No," she said finally. "If I'm going to speak, I'll show my face. He tried to erase me in public. I'll reclaim myself the same way." Sarah's voice softened. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Isabella said. "Let's do it." A few hours later, in a quiet hospital media room, the camera light blinked red. Isabella sat in a simple pale blue blouse, her hair tied back. No makeup, no glamour, just truth. She took a deep breath. "My name is Isabella Carter," she said slowly. "You've seen what happened to me. You've heard what he said. I'm not here for pity. I'm here for every woman who has been told to keep quiet. I believed that silence would protect me. It didn't. Speaking out is the only thing that does." Her eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "No one deserves to live in fear. No one deserves to be hit, humiliated, or treated like they are invisible. I survived, but many don't. I will fight not just for myself, but for them." She paused, exhaled, and whispered, "To my father, thank you. You gave me back my voice." The recording ended. Sarah immediately sent the clip to major networks. Within an hour, It was trending worldwide. In the Carter Holdings tower, Robert and David stood side by side watching the video. Robert's eyes filled with pride. "That's my daughter," he said softly. David smiled. "She sounds just like you." Meanwhile, at the Kane penthouse, Edward watched the broadcast in disbelief. The whiskey glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. His phone buzzed endlessly with messages from board members resigning. The company's stock had dropped another 30%. "Sir?" his assistant said nervously, entering the room. "The board wants you to step down immediately." Edward glared at him. "Get out." When he was alone, he turned back to the television. Isabella's face filled the screen, calm, fearless. For the first time, the man who had once felt untouchable realized that his power had vanished. Outside, the rain stopped. The city lights reflected against the wet streets, glowing with a faint hue of blue. It was the color of truth, the color of a woman who had finally found her strength. The courthouse in downtown Manhattan was surrounded by flashing cameras and shouting reporters. The steps that had once been walked by CEOs and politicians now became the stage for a battle between justice and corruption. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. The trial of Edward Kane had begun. Isabella Carter arrived early that morning, escorted by 2 security guards and her father. She wore a simple navy blue dress that draped softly over her 8-month belly. Her face looked pale but calm. Each step she took up the marble staircase seemed to echo louder than the crowd itself. The flash of cameras followed her like lightning. Behind her walked Robert Carter, composed and silent, the kind of silence that carried authority. Sarah Chen followed with a stack of documents pressed against her chest, her expression unreadable. David Carter stayed close, scanning every face in the crowd for threats. Reporters shouted questions from every direction. "Mrs. Carter, do you forgive your husband? Are you ready to testify? Is it true the baby survived the attack?" Isabella kept walking without answering. Her hand rested protectively on her belly. When they reached the top of the stairs, Robert paused for a moment and faced the press. "We are not here for spectacle," he said calmly. "We are here for truth." Then he turned and led his daughter inside. The courtroom was grand and solemn. Wooden benches gleamed under fluorescent lights. At the center sat Judge Harrison Vaughn, a man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a calm presence. He had seen hundreds of cases in his career, but none that carried this level of attention. As the proceedings began, Edward Kane entered flanked by his legal team. His once perfect hair was graying at the edges. His suit no longer fit as well. The arrogance in his eyes had dulled but not disappeared. He glanced at Isabella briefly, then looked away. The judge struck the gavel once. "Court is now in session." The prosecution began by presenting the timeline of the assault. Sarah Chen rose from her seat and addressed the court. Her voice was calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a story about wealth or power. It is a story about cruelty and the courage it takes to stand against it. My client, Mrs. Isabella Carter, suffered 300 lashes while carrying her unborn child. Tonight we seek justice not just for her, but for every woman who has been silenced by fear." She paused, letting the words sink in. Then she called the first witness. Linda Parker took the stand, her hands shaking slightly as she swore the oath. Sarah approached gently. "Mrs. Parker, can you tell the court what you saw that night?" Linda's voice trembled. "He hit her, over and over. She tried to protect her belly. Everyone just watched. I recorded it because I knew no one would believe it otherwise." Sarah nodded. "And this video, which has been verified by forensic experts, is the original footage you took?" "Yes," Linda said, tears in her eyes. "It's the truth." The video played on a large screen. Gasps filled the courtroom as the sound of the whip cracked through the speakers. Isabella looked down, unable to watch. Robert placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. When the video ended, Sarah called the next witness, Dr. Ethan Brooks. The young physician took the stand, his expression grave. "Dr. Brooks," Sarah began, "you were the attending physician after the assault. Can you describe Mrs. Carter's condition when she arrived?" He nodded. She had extensive bruising and lacerations. Her back was severely injured, and she showed signs of trauma and shock. The baby's heartbeat was faint but present. It was a miracle they both survived. Sarah's voice softened. Would you say her injuries were consistent with the attack shown in the video? Yes, he said. Absolutely consistent. The defense lawyer rose for cross-examination, trying to sound confident. Doctor, isn't it possible that my client lost control, that it was an emotional outburst rather than an intentional act of harm? Dr. Brooks looked him straight in the eye. 300 lashes are not an emotional outburst. They are deliberate. The courtroom fell silent again. Next came Isabella's turn. She stood slowly, supported by Robert's arm. The judge nodded respectfully. Mrs. Carter, please take your time. She walked to the witness stand, each step careful but steady. When she sat, Sarah approached gently. Isabella, do you remember that night? Her voice was quiet but clear. Yes, I remember everything. Can you tell us why you didn't leave him earlier? Isabella's eyes filled with tears. Because I believed love could fix him. Because I thought if I was patient, he'd change. I didn't want my child to grow up without a father. I was wrong. Silence doesn't save you. It destroys you. Her words rippled through the courtroom like thunder. The defense lawyer stood. Mrs. Carter, isn't it true that you and your father have a financial motive to ruin Mr. Kane? Robert rose instantly. Objection. Sustained, the judge said firmly. Watch your line, counselor. The defense lawyer retreated, muttering. When Isabella finished her testimony, she looked at Edward for the first time. You took everything from me, she said softly, but you didn't take my soul. That belongs to the child you tried to destroy. Edward's face turned pale. For the first time, he had no words. As the closing statements approached, Sarah Chen stood before the jury one last time. Justice is not about revenge, she said. It's about accountability. When a man believes he is untouchable, that is when the law must remind him that no one stands above it. Judge Vaughn struck the gavel again. The court will reconvene tomorrow for the verdict. When Isabella rose to leave, the crowd outside the courtroom erupted into applause. Reporters shouted her name. Some cried openly. For them, she had become more than a victim. She had become a symbol. Outside on the courthouse steps, Robert placed a protective arm around her. You were brave today, he said softly. She smiled faintly. I wasn't brave, Dad. I was tired of being afraid. The wind blew gently, carrying the faint sound of church bells in the distance. For the first time in months, Isabella felt peace settle inside her. The truth was no longer trapped in shadows. It was alive, visible to the world. And somewhere inside that courthouse, behind closed doors, Edward Kane sat alone, his arrogance stripped away, knowing that the next sunrise would bring judgment he could no longer escape. The morning of the verdict arrived with the weight of a nation watching. The courthouse was surrounded by a sea of people holding signs that read, "Justice for Isabella and no mercy for the abuser." News vans lined the street. Every television channel in America carried the same headline, "The Trial of Edward Kane, Verdict Day." Inside, the courtroom was silent, except for the clicking of cameras. The air felt heavy, as if everyone was holding a collective breath. Isabella sat beside her father, hands resting over her belly. She could feel the faint movements of her unborn child. Robert Carter sat next to her, calm but unreadable. His face was a mask carved from resolve. Judge Harrison Vaughn entered and took his seat. The gavel struck once. All rise! The crowd stood. When the judge began to read, the entire room froze. After reviewing all evidence presented, including video footage, witness testimony, and forensic analysis, this court finds the defendant, Edward Kane, guilty on all counts. Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge continued, Mr. Kane is hereby convicted of aggravated assault, forgery, financial fraud, and the willful endangerment of a pregnant woman. He will serve a minimum sentence of 15 years in state prison, with additional penalties pending further investigation. Lo! The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder. The courtroom erupted. Some clapped, others cried. Reporters scrambled toward the exits to broadcast the news first. Isabella sat still for a moment, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She looked at Robert, who placed a firm, comforting hand over hers. "It's over," he whispered. "He can't touch you anymore." Across the room, Edward sat motionless. His lawyers whispered frantically, but he no longer listened. His empire, his pride, his control, everything had evaporated in seconds. For the first time in his life, he looked small. As security led him away in handcuffs, he turned his head and met Isabella's eyes. She didn't look away. Her expression was calm, not vengeful. That was what broke him most. Outside, the city roared with reaction. Television crews reported live as headlines flashed across every screen. Edward Kane sentenced. Carter family triumphs in court. Back inside the courthouse, Sarah Chen shook Robert's hand. "You did what few men with power ever do," she said quietly. "You used it for good." Robert's reply was simple. "It's what power is meant for." Later that evening, the Carter family returned to their private residence. The media still swarmed outside, but security kept them at bay. Inside the quiet mansion, Robert stood by the window watching the lights of the city flicker like stars below. David entered carrying a folder. "The markets have reacted," David said. "Kane Group shares are down 80%. Investors are fleeing. The board announced his removal effective immediately." Robert nodded slowly. "And the assets?" "Frozen," David replied. "Every major bank has cut ties. He's done." There was no satisfaction in Robert's face, only calm. "Good. Make sure every employee gets paid. No one else should suffer for his sins." David looked surprised. "You're serious?" Robert turned toward him. "Yes. We destroy his power, not his people. That's the difference between us and him." David smiled faintly. "Mom would have said the same thing." Robert's expression softened. "Your mother always believed in mercy after justice. I'm still learning." Across the city, Edward sat alone in a holding cell. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The sound of the door closing behind him was sharp and final. He looked down at his hands, no longer adorned with the expensive watch he once wore like a crown. The silence was suffocating. For the first time, he had nothing left to manipulate, no one left to control. Meanwhile, Isabella was still at the hospital for observation. The stress of the trial had strained her body, and the doctors wanted her under care. The room was quiet except for the steady heartbeat of her unborn child on the monitor. She looked at the ceiling, tears welling again. But these were not tears of pain, they were of relief. Robert entered quietly. He pulled a chair to her bedside. "You did it," he said softly. "We did it," she corrected. "You stood up for me when I couldn't." He smiled faintly. "That's what fathers do." She took his hand. "I used to think power was what destroyed people. Now I see it's the lack of love that does." Robert squeezed her fingers gently. "Love is the only power that lasts." Across town, the Carter Holdings headquarters held a press conference. Reporters filled the room. Cameras clicked as Robert stepped to the podium, wearing his dark suit and calm expression. The lights reflected faintly on the silver streaks in his hair. He began, his voice low and commanding. "Today is not a day of victory. It is a day of accountability. The law has spoken. But we must remember that justice is not vengeance. It is a lesson. When a man believes his wealth places him above the law, that is when society must remind him that no one is untouchable." He paused. The crowd hung on every word. "This case has inspired many to speak out. If even one woman finds the courage to leave an abusive home because of what my daughter endured, then her pain will not be in vain." The Carter family stands with every survivor. The room erupted in applause. The cameras flashed, capturing the image of a father who had turned grief into purpose. Later that night, the story dominated every major network. Anchors spoke of Robert Carter as the Iron Father. Social media overflowed with messages of support. At home, Isabella watched the broadcast from her hospital bed. The blue glow of the screen bathed her face in soft light. Her father's words filled the room. She placed her hand over her belly and whispered, "He did it." The baby kicked lightly in response, as if answering her. For the first time in months, she felt something she had not felt since before the nightmare began. Safety. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city lights shimmered against puddles on the streets. It was quiet, almost peaceful. In the Carter mansion, Robert walked through the halls, the weight of months of battle finally lifting from his shoulders. He entered his study, where an old photograph of Isabella as a child sat on his desk. He picked it up and smiled. "You're safe now, sweetheart," he murmured. "You're finally safe." He looked out the window one last time before turning off the light. The skyline glowed faintly in pale blue hues, reflecting the color of hope that now belonged to them both. 1 year had passed since the verdict that shook New York. The memory of Edward Kane's downfall still lingered in every headline, every whisper of corporate gossip. His empire was gone, his name erased from the towers that once bore it. But tonight, at the Waldorf Astoria, the same ballroom that had witnessed Isabella Carter's humiliation would now witness her triumph. The grand chandeliers glittered above a sea of guests. Music floated softly through the air. Journalists and dignitaries filled the hall, waiting for the annual Carter Foundation Gala. This year's theme was simple and powerful: hope restored. Isabella stood behind the curtain of the stage, breathing slowly. Her light blue gown shimmered under the soft lighting. The fabric flowed like water around her. It was not just a dress, it was a statement. The color that once symbolized her pain now represented rebirth. Robert stood beside her, looking proud and calm. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. She smiled faintly. "I've been ready for a long time." The announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Isabella Carter, founder of the Hope Foundation." Applause thundered across the hall as Isabella stepped into the light. Cameras flashed from every direction. She walked gracefully to the podium, her heart pounding but her steps steady. When she reached the microphone, she paused, letting the applause fade. "1 year ago," she began, her voice clear, "this ballroom was a place of pain. Tonight, it is a place of purpose." The audience fell silent. "I stand before you not as a victim, but as proof that survival is possible. My story was made public without my consent, but I have chosen to reclaim it. The Hope Foundation exists for women who think they have no way out. It exists so that no one ever has to live through what I did." Tears glistened in the eyes of many listeners. Robert stood at the side of the stage, watching her with quiet pride. Isabella continued, "Forgiveness is not weakness, it is freedom. My father taught me that true power is not measured by how much we control others, but by how much we protect them." The audience rose in a standing ovation. The sound echoed through the grand hall like redemption itself. Outside, beyond the golden doors, a man stood in the rain. His suit was wrinkled, his hair unkempt. It was Edward Kane. He had come out of curiosity, or perhaps out of desperation, to see what he had lost. The guards at the entrance stopped him immediately. "Invitation, sir?" one of them asked firmly. Edward's voice was low, tired. "I just want to look, that's all." The guard shook his head. "This event is private." Edward took a step closer, glancing through the glass doors. From where he stood, he could see Isabella on stage. She looked radiant, untouchable. Her father stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. They were everything he had tried to destroy, and they had survived him. He swallowed hard, his reflection merging with the glass. The faint music from inside drifted out as the doors opened briefly to allow another guest in. The guard closed them again, and Edward was left outside. Inside, the gala continued with elegance. Robert took the stage next, his presence commanding instant silence. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate the courage of women who have turned pain into power. But we also remember that justice is not the end of a story, it is the beginning of rebuilding." He turned toward Isabella. "My daughter taught me that resilience can be inherited. She reminded me that even in the darkest nights, there is a light worth protecting." The crowd erupted once more in applause. The soft blue lights bathed the ballroom, creating an almost dreamlike glow. Back outside, Edward lingered near the fountain, drenched by rain. The sound of water splashing mixed with the muffled applause coming from inside. He sank onto a marble bench, head in his hands. No cameras followed him now, no admirers gathered. The empire he had built was dust, and the woman he had once controlled was now the face of strength. A reporter recognized him from a distance and whispered to her cameraman. "That's him," she said quietly. "Edward Kane. Look at him now." But she did not film. Even the media had lost interest in his misery. Inside the ballroom, the music shifted to a gentle piano melody. Isabella held her father's arm as they descended from the stage. People approached to congratulate them, politicians, philanthropists, and survivors who had found hope through the foundation. One young woman stepped forward, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You saved me," she said softly. "I left because of your story." Isabella embraced her without hesitation. "No, sweetheart, you saved yourself. I just reminded you that you could." Robert watched the exchange with quiet pride. For him, this night was not about revenge. It was about closure. The cycle of pain had ended here, in the same place it had begun. Later in the evening, Isabella walked alone to the balcony overlooking the city. The rain had stopped, and the skyline glowed under the soft blue lights of the gala. She closed her eyes and breathed in deeply. The air smelled clean, new. Robert joined her, his footsteps quiet. "You did it," he said gently. She turned to him. "No, Dad, we did it." He smiled. "Maybe, but tonight the world saw you, not as the woman who was hurt, but as the woman who rose." She looked over the city, her hand resting on the balcony rail. "I think Mom would have liked this view." "She would have loved it," he replied softly. Below them, photographers took one last wide shot of the gala, capturing the glowing blue light through the windows. To the public, it looked like a fairy tale ending, but to Isabella, it was more than that. It was proof that light could bloom even from brokenness. Inside the hall, guests raised their glasses in a final toast. The orchestra played the last note of the night. The applause rolled like gentle thunder. Outside, Edward Kane rose from the bench and looked up at the bright windows above. The reflection of blue light shimmered across his face. Then he turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing without a sound. Back inside, Isabella looked toward the same glass doors where her nightmare had once begun. She smiled faintly. The ghosts of that night were gone. Only hope remained. The first light of morning spilled over Los Angeles like a promise. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes only after a storm. On a glass building downtown, a new silver sign gleamed under the rising Sunday. It read, "The Hope Foundation." Inside the building, the lobby buzzed with energy. Fresh flowers lined the marble entrance, their pale blue petals arranged in neat rows. Reporters waited near the glass doors, their cameras ready. But this time the attention was gentle. It was admiration, not intrusion. Isabella Carter stood near the podium at the front of the hall, her daughter in her arms. The baby, only a few months old, had soft curls and curious eyes that reflected the light. She named her Hope, the word that had carried her through every night of pain. She looked around the lobby filled with guests, survivors, and friends. It was the official opening of the foundation she had built from the ashes of her tragedy. Every corner of the building symbolized a step toward healing. The walls were painted in soft, sky-blue tones, and engraved on the entrance plaque were the words, "Out of pain, we rise." Robert Carter stood nearby, dressed in a black suit and light blue tie, his silver hair glowing in the morning light. He smiled as he watched his daughter speak to guests, his expression filled with pride. Beside him was David Carter, who had managed the financial structure of the foundation. Together, they had turned vengeance into vision. When it was time, the announcer called Isabella to the podium. Applause filled the hall as she stepped forward, holding her daughter close. She paused to steady her voice. "A year ago," she began, "I stood in a courtroom waiting for justice. Today, I stand in a place built from that justice." The room went silent. This foundation exists for women who think they are alone, for mothers who believe they have nowhere to go. I was one of them once. I believed silence would protect me. But silence only hides the pain. Speaking saved my life, and it gave me the strength to help others find theirs. She glanced at Robert, who nodded proudly. "My father showed me what real power means. It isn't about money or control. It's about standing up when no one else will. He taught me that strength begins the moment fear ends." The crowd erupted in applause. Tears glistened on faces throughout the room. Isabella smiled, kissed her daughter's forehead, and whispered softly, "This is for you." Later, after the ceremony, she walked outside to the steps of the building. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of flowers from the garden below. A journalist approached gently. "Mrs. Carter," she asked, "how does it feel to have turned such a dark chapter into something so beautiful?" Isabella thought for a moment. "It feels like breathing again," she said. "Pain changes you, but it doesn't have to define you. You can build something from it. You just have to decide that it ends with you." The journalist smiled, thanked her, and walked away. Robert joined her on the steps, his hands in his pockets. "You handled that well," he said with a proud grin. She laughed softly. "I had a good teacher." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city wake up. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and pale blue. It was the same color that had followed her since that terrible night, now transformed into something pure. "I've been thinking," Robert said quietly. "It's time we go back to the house." She turned to him, surprised. "The mansion?" He nodded. "You don't have to, but I think there's something there waiting to be finished." That afternoon, they drove together to the old Carter estate in Beverly Hills. The gates opened slowly, creaking as if awakening from a long sleep. The house was just as she remembered, elegant but haunted by memories. Inside, the grand staircase still gleamed under the sunlight filtering through tall windows. It was the same staircase where she had once fallen, clutching her belly, where the world had gone black before everything changed. Robert placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't owe this place anything," he said softly. Isabella walked slowly to the fifth step, the one where her blood had once stained the marble. She knelt down and placed a small bouquet of light blue flowers on the stair. Her hand lingered there for a moment. "This isn't for him," she said quietly. "It's for me." Robert stood behind her, watching silently. She looked up at the sunlight streaming through the glass windows. "I forgive him," she said. "Not because he deserves it, but because I deserve peace." Robert's eyes softened. "That's how healing begins." She rose to her feet, holding her daughter close. The baby stirred, tiny fingers gripping her dress. Isabella smiled through tears. "She'll never know the darkness I did," she said. "No," Robert agreed. "She'll know light, because you turned it on." They stood there for a while, the sound of the wind rustling through the curtains. Outside, the city hummed with life. Somewhere far away, a church bell rang, marking the hour. As they walked out of the mansion, Isabella took one last look at the staircase. It no longer looked like a place of pain. It looked like a place of rebirth. Back at the foundation later that evening, the building glowed with warm light. Survivors gathered in the main hall, sharing stories, holding hands, and finding strength in one another. Isabella walked among them quietly, smiling as she passed. Every voice in that room was part of something she had built from the ground up. At the end of the night, Robert stood near the exit, watching her. David joined him, folding his arms with pride. "She did it," he said softly. Robert nodded. "She became the woman her mother always believed she'd be." Outside, the city lights flickered under the clear night sky. Isabella stepped out, holding baby Hope in her arms. The wind lifted her hair as she looked up at the stars. She whispered, "We're free now." The baby cooed softly, her small hand reaching toward the light. Isabella smiled and kissed her forehead. As she walked toward the car, the glass doors of the foundation reflected her image. No longer the woman who had been broken, but the woman who had rebuilt herself piece by piece. Behind her, on the wall above the entrance, the foundation's motto shimmered in silver, "Out of pain, we rise." And in that final moment, as dawn touched the horizon once more, Isabella Carter knew she had done more than survive. She had created a legacy that would never fade.